a dusty old shack filled with spider webs and rot. My sister laughed, flipping her new apartment key in the air. Have fun with your haunted books, loser. My parents didn't even say goodbye. But when I opened the door to that crumbling house and stepped into the forgotten library, I couldn't breathe. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent my entire adult life surrounded by books, yet my family treated my profession like an elaborate hobby. While Elena climbed corporate ladders in her gleaming heels, orchestrating million-dollar advertising campaigns from her glass-walled office in Prague, I cataloged rare manuscripts in the university's archive basement. While she posted Instagram stories from wine bars and gallery openings, her feed a curated symphony of success, I spent evenings carefully repairing torn pages with museum-grade adhesive, working by lamplight until my eyes burned. "Still playing with your little books?" Mother would ask during our monthly obligatory phone calls, her voice carrying that particular tone reserved for discussing disappointing children. She'd inevitably pivot to Alina's latest promotion, her newest designer handbag, her apartment's rising property value. Father was no better. During family dinners, rare, stilted affairs, he'd make a show of asking about my work, then glaze over within minutes. "That's nice, dear," he'd say, already turning to Elena to discuss stock portfolios and investment opportunities. Elena herself barely acknowledged my existence unless she needed something, help moving apartments, someone to watch her designer luggage during brief layovers, a convenient excuse to avoid family obligations. "Maya can handle it," she'd say with a dismissive wave. "She doesn't have anything better to do." But grandmother never made me feel small. I'd take the 3-hour train journey to her village every few months, carrying a canvas bag filled with whatever fascinating volume I'd discovered that week. The trip itself was a meditation, rolling countryside giving way to ancient forests, modern suburbs dissolving into stone villages that seemed untouched by time. Grandmother's house sat at the end of a cobblestone lane, its white walls and red tile roof looking like something from a fairy tale. She'd brew tea in her chipped porcelain cups, the same set she'd inherited from her own grandmother, and we'd settle into the worn leather chairs in her library. The room was impossibly grand for such a modest house, with floor-to-ceiling shelves holding volumes in languages I couldn't identify. Czech and German, certainly, but also what looked like Russian, Hungarian, maybe Polish. Their spines were cracked with age and handling, some so old the titles had faded to ghostly impressions. "Books hold voices," she'd tell me, running her arthritic fingers along a particularly ancient binding. "Some people think they're silent, but they're only waiting for the right person to listen." She'd pull down volumes seemingly at random, a collection of Moravian folk tales, a treatise on medieval architecture, a thin book of poetry by someone I'd never heard of, and we'd read together in comfortable silence. Sometimes she'd share stories about how she'd acquired particular books, speaking in hushed tones about estate sales and private collections, about professors who'd fled the country during various political upheavals, leaving behind libraries that needed new guardians. "Your grandfather thought I was crazy," she'd laugh, gesturing at the packed shelves. "All this money spent on dusty old books when we could have had a newer car, a bigger house." But I always told him, cars break down, houses crumble, but stories live forever if someone bothers to save them. Elena never visited unless she needed something, a quiet place to recover from a bad breakup, a free weekend away from Prague's demanding social scene. Even then, she'd spend most of her time on her phone, taking calls about campaigns and clients, treating the village like a quaint backdrop for her busy, important life. Mother and father made their appearances twice a year, bringing expensive wine they'd bought at the Prague airport and impatient sighs. They'd fidget through dinner, checking their phones, eager to return to their important lives in the capital. The conversation always centered on Elena's achievements, father's latest business ventures, mother's volunteer work with various prestigious charitable organizations. "And how are your books, Maya?" Mother would ask with forced brightness, the same way she might inquire about a pet's health. When grandmother's call didn't come that Tuesday evening, our weekly tradition for over a decade, I knew something was wrong. I tried calling back, then called the village doctor, then Alina, then our parents. It was father who delivered the news with characteristic efficiency. Heart attack, peaceful in her sleep. The funeral was small, attended mostly by villagers whose names I half remembered from childhood summers spent exploring the surrounding forests and streams. Mrs. Chishkova from the bakery wept openly. Mr. Svoboda, who'd maintained grandmother's garden for 30 years, stood silently among the roses she'd loved. The village priest spoke about a woman who'd been a pillar of the community, who'd donated books to the local school, who'd always had time to listen to anyone's troubles. Elena arrived late, checking her phone throughout the service. Our parents sat stiffly in the front pew, whispering about property values and estate taxes, treating the funeral like an inconvenient business meeting. I wanted to scream at them to demand they show some respect, but grandmother's voice echoed in my memory. Dignity, Maya. Always choose dignity. The will reading took place 3 days later in the village lawyer's cramped office, all dark wood and dusty law books that seemed to mock the family's impatience. Mr. Kozlov, ancient and methodical, adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles and cleared his throat with bureaucratic precision. To my granddaughter Elena, who has always reached for the stars and achieved remarkable success in the modern world, I leave the apartment in Prague, fully furnished, overlooking Wenceslas Square, along with all contents and associated investments. Elena's smile was radiant, victorious. She'd been expecting this, of course. The city apartment was worth a fortune, prime real estate in Prague's most desirable district, decorated with antiques and original artwork. Grandmother had collected over decades. And to my granddaughter Maya, who has always understood that true treasure lies in forgotten places, and who shares my belief that some things are more valuable than money, I leave the family home and all its contents, including the complete library collection and all associated papers and documents. The silence stretched uncomfortably. I could feel Elena calculating, trying to figure out if there was hidden value in what seemed like the lesser inheritance. Our parents exchanged meaningful glances, the kind that spoke volumes about disappointment and damaged expectations. Elena's laugh broke the silence first, sharp and dismissive. A charity case even in death, she said, not bothering to lower her voice. God, Maya, even Grandma pitied you. A crumbling house in the middle of nowhere while I get prime Prague real estate. Our parents exchanged glances. Father cleared his throat with the authority of someone accustomed to making pronouncements. Well, you'll be happier among your books anyway, he said with false cheerfulness. More your speed. Less complicated than city life. Mother nodded in agreement. It's actually quite thoughtful when you think about it. You never did adapt well to modern expectations. I didn't cry, didn't argue, didn't point out that they were essentially kicking me out of the family with their dismissive cruelty. I simply signed the papers with steady hands, pocketed the brass key that looked older than the village itself, and walked to the bus station while they discussed dinner plans that obviously didn't include me. The last thing I heard as I boarded the afternoon bus was Elena telling someone on her phone about her gorgeous new place in the heart of Prague and how she'd finally gotten something worthwhile from the old bat. The 3-hour journey back to the village gave me time to process everything that had happened. The bus wound through countryside I'd traveled dozens of times to visit grandmother, but now I was seeing it with different eyes. This wasn't a visit anymore. This was coming home to a place I'd inherited, a responsibility I'd accepted, a life I'd have to build from scratch. The house looked smaller than I remembered, its white paint peeling like old skin. The garden had grown wild in the months since grandmother's death, roses overtaking the fence in a way that might have been beautiful if it weren't so clearly neglected. Wild grass pushed through cracks in the cobblestone path, and the wooden shutters hung at odd angles, giving the entire place a melancholy air. I stood on the threshold for a long moment, key heavy in my palm, brass warming against my skin. This was it, the sum total of my inheritance, the thing my family considered worthless. A house that needed work, in a village with more retirees than young families, hours away from anything resembling civilization. But it was mine. The door opened with a groan that seemed to echo through empty rooms. Dust motes danced in shafts of afternoon light filtering through unwashed windows, and the air tasted of old wood and forgotten time. Each step on the hardwood floors announced my presence to a house that had been waiting, holding its breath, preserving memories in the spaces between walls. I moved through rooms that held fragments of memory, the kitchen where grandmother had taught me to make her special tea blend, measuring herbs with the precision of an alchemist. The sitting room where she'd listened to classical music on an ancient radio that somehow still worked, its wooden case polished smooth by decades of careful handling. Her bedroom, still smelling faintly of the lavender sachets she'd kept in every drawer. Everything was exactly as she'd left it, as if she'd simply stepped out for a walk and would return any moment with stories about the neighbors or observations about the weather. Her reading glasses still sat on the nightstand next to a half-finished crossword puzzle. A bookmark marked her place in a volume of Neruda's poetry, waiting for her to return and discover what happened next. But it was the library that called to me, the way it always had. The heavy wooden door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open with something approaching reverence. The room beyond took my breath away, not because it had changed, but because it hadn't. Every shelf was exactly as I remembered, packed with volumes that seemed to pulse with patient energy. Afternoon sunlight slanted through tall windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced like tiny spirits among the books. But something was different. In the center of the room, placed deliberately on the reading table where grandmother and I had shared so many quiet afternoons, sat a wooden chest I'd never seen before. It was dark with age, its surface carved with intricate patterns that spoke of old-world craftsmanship. An ornate brass lock secured its contents, and beside it lay an envelope with my name written in grandmother's careful script. My hands trembled as I opened the letter, her familiar handwriting blurring through sudden tears. My dearest Maya, if you are reading this, then you have come home to where you belong. I know your family sees only an old house filled with old books, but you have always understood that age is where wisdom lives, that quiet corners often hold the loudest truths. The real inheritance isn't the house, though it will shelter you well. It isn't even the books, though they will teach you more than any university ever could. The real inheritance is the responsibility to keep voices alive that the world has tried to silence. For 60 years, I have been more than a collector. I have been a guardian. During the war, during the communist years, during times when books were burned and ideas were banned, I saved what I could. Sometimes I bought collections from desperate families. Sometimes professors fleeing the country entrusted me with manuscripts they couldn't take. Sometimes I simply rescued books from houses being demolished, libraries being modernized, estates being liquidated by heirs who saw only old paper where I saw immortal voices. In the chest, you'll find the key to everything I've been protecting. Some of these works haven't seen daylight in decades. Some are thought to be lost forever. Some are dangerous. Not because they contain terrible secrets, but because they contain beautiful truths that certain people would prefer to keep buried. You'll know what to do. You always did understand the difference between price and value, between ownership and stewardship. The stories chose you long before I did. All my love and all my faith, Grandmother P.S. The key is behind Neruda's collected poems, third shelf from the top. You always loved that hiding spot when you were small. My legs felt unsteady as I crossed the room to the towering bookshelf. There, nestled between volumes of Czech poetry, was the familiar spine of Pablo Neruda's collected works, the same edition grandmother had read to me when I was barely tall enough to see over the table. My fingers found the gap behind it automatically, muscle memory guiding me to the small brass key hidden in the shadows. The chest opened with a soft click that seemed to echo through centuries. Inside lay treasures that made my librarian's heart race and my hands shake with the magnitude of what I was seeing. Manuscripts wrapped in acid-free paper, documents in protective sleeves, photographs and correspondence. But it was the leather-bound journal on top that caught my attention first. Thick with entries spanning decades, grandmother's handwriting documenting a secret life I'd never suspected. The first entry was dated 1963. Acquired Dvořák personal letters from estate sale, Family had no idea of historical significance. Must research provenance and find proper repository when political climate improves. Another, from 1975, Professor Svoboda, fleeing to London tonight, entrusted me with his complete manuscript collection, including banned works by Havel and others. Hidden in cellar until safer times. And another, from 1989, revolution changes everything, but some books still need protection. Private collectors care nothing for cultural significance, only profit. Must continue the work. Page after page revealed the truth. Grandmother hadn't been simply collecting books. She'd been preserving them, saving banned texts from communist purges, recovering stolen manuscripts from private collections, protecting works that museums and governments had written off as lost forever. She'd been running a one-woman archive, a secret repository for the literary history of a nation. I worked through the night, carefully examining each item with the professional skills I'd developed over years of archival work. My training kicked in automatically. I photographed everything, created preliminary catalogs, cross-referenced names and dates against my mental database of Czech literary history. What I found defied belief. The chest contained fragments of the literary soul of Central Europe. Unpublished works by Karel Čapek, the science fiction pioneer whose later manuscripts had supposedly been destroyed after his death. Personal correspondence between Václav Havel and other banned writers during the darkest years of communist rule. Manuscripts that had been smuggled out of burning libraries during World War II, saved by brave librarians and professors who'd risked their lives to preserve knowledge. But the crown jewel lay at the very bottom, wrapped in the finest preservation materials money could buy. An original manuscript by John Kolar, the 19th century poet whose later works had been thought destroyed during World War II. Not just any manuscript, his personal annotations on Slavic mythology and folklore, the theoretical foundation for half a dozen literary movements that followed. I held it with trembling hands, this document that scholars had theorized about for decades but never expected to see. The paper was thick and yellowed with age, covered in Kolar's distinctive handwriting, notes and observations that revealed the intellectual process behind some of the most influential poetry in Czech history. I knew enough about rare books and historical documents to understand exactly what I was holding. This wasn't just valuable, it was priceless. Museums would wage bidding wars. Private collectors would mortgage their souls. Academic institutions would fund entire departments just for the chance to study these materials. But more than that, I understood why grandmother had chosen me. These weren't commodities to be sold to the highest bidder. They were voices that had been silenced, stories that had been forbidden, ideas that had been deemed too dangerous for their times by people who feared the power of truth. They were exactly what the world needed to hear. I spent the next 6 months transforming the house into a proper archive, a process that required every penny of my modest savings and then some. The old heating system was replaced with climate control that could maintain the precise temperature and humidity levels necessary for document preservation. The windows were fitted with UV filtering glass that would protect the books from harmful light, while still allowing the natural illumination that made the library so magical. Every book received individual attention, careful cleaning with museum-grade materials, professional assessment of condition, proper cataloging in databases that would make the collections searchable for researchers. I worked 16-hour days, fueled by tea, and the growing realization of just how extraordinary grandmother's collection truly was. Word spread carefully, deliberately. I reached out to colleagues from my university days, professors who specialized in Czech literature, museum curators I'd met at conferences over the years. I shared photographs of the less controversial pieces first, beautiful but not earth-shattering finds that would establish my credibility before I revealed the true scope of what grandmother had preserved. Dr. Svoboda from Charles University was the first to make the pilgrimage to the village, arriving on a foggy October morning with the reverent air of someone approaching a shrine. He spent 3 days examining manuscripts, his excitement growing with each discovery. I watched his face as he turned pages that hadn't been seen by academic eyes for decades, witnessed the moment when scholarly composure gave way to pure wonder. Maya, do you understand what you have here? He asked on his final morning, holding Kolar's manuscript with white cotton gloves. This rewrites our understanding of 19th century literary development. This is the missing link we've theorized about for decades. Scholars have built entire careers speculating about what these notes might contain. The second visitor was Dr. Elizabeth Harper from Oxford, a specialist in rescued wartime documents who'd made her reputation tracking down Nazi-looted manuscripts. She arrived with portable X-ray equipment and a team of graduate students, spending a week authenticating everything I showed her. Her methodology was exhaustive, analyzing paper composition, ink chemistry, even the microscopic characteristics of individual pen strokes. Your grandmother was extraordinary, she told me over tea in the garden, surrounded by the roses that had grown wild but somehow more beautiful in their abandon. She wasn't just collecting. She was operating a shadow archive, preserving works that official institutions couldn't or wouldn't protect. This collection represents the unofficial literary history of Central Europe, the voices that survived because one woman cared enough to hide them in a village library. The third visitor was a journalist, a young woman from Prague who'd heard whispers about the collection through academic channels and convinced her editor that there might be a story worth telling. What started as a brief profile piece expanded into a week-long investigation as she began to understand the scope of what grandmother had accomplished. Village Librarian Uncovers Lost Literary Treasures ran simultaneously in 3 newspapers, picked up by wire services, and translated into a dozen languages within days. The story caught fire on social media, shared by academics and book lovers around the world who understood the significance of what had been preserved. Then the literary journals picked it up. Then the international press. Then the documentary filmmakers and collectors and museum directors. My phone rang constantly. Private collectors offered obscene amounts of money for individual pieces. Museums proposed acquisition deals that would have made me wealthy beyond imagination. Publishing houses wanted to produce facsimile editions. Hollywood producers called about film rights. I declined them all. Instead, I accepted funding from the International Archive Preservation Foundation, a consortium of universities and cultural institutions dedicated to protecting literary heritage. They understood that some treasures belonged to humanity as a whole, not to whoever could pay the highest price. The conversion of the house into a research center took another 6 months, and an international team of specialists. Architects who understood the unique requirements of archival storage. Engineers who could install state-of-the-art security systems without destroying the historical character of the building. Conservators who approached each room like a surgeon approaching a patient, careful to preserve what was valuable, while making necessary improvements. The irony wasn't lost on me that my name was suddenly appearing in academic journals and international newspapers. The Quiet Guardian of Lost Voices read one headline in the Times Literary Supplement. Another, in the Czech Cultural Weekly, called me the librarian who redrew literary history. Elena saw the articles, of course. She always kept track of anything that might reflect on the family name, especially when it involved money or prestige. My phone buzzed with notification after notification as she shared articles on social media, adding captions like, "So proud of my brilliant sister," and "Talent runs in the family." She'd never called me brilliant before. Had never publicly acknowledged having a sister, actually. They arrived on a Tuesday morning in late spring without warning, a black rental BMW pulling up the cobblestone lane like they owned it. I watched from the library window as Elena stepped out first. Designer heels sinking into the gravel, followed by our parents in their most expensive casual wear, the kind of carefully calculated informality that cost more than most people's formal clothes. Elena knocked on the door I now thought of as mine, rather than simply walking in the way she might have during her childhood visits. "Maya, this place looks incredible." Her smile was as bright and artificial as her Instagram filter settings, the same dazzling expression she used for client presentations. "I can't believe what you've done with the old place. It's like something out of Architectural Digest." Behind her, mother and father nodded approvingly at the restored exterior, The professional signage marking the house as the Vaclava Novak Literary Sanctuary. The small bronze plaque designating it as a protected cultural site under Czech heritage law. "We're so proud of you," Mother said, though the words felt foreign in her mouth, like she was speaking a language she'd learned phonetically. "Who would have thought your little hobby would turn into something so significant, so internationally recognized?" Father was already calculating, his businessman's mind working through possibilities. The media attention alone must be worth millions in equivalent advertising. "You've created a brand here, Maya. A real cultural brand with international recognition." I offered them tea and a tour, playing the gracious host while they marveled at the transformation. The house that had been worthless now hosted visiting scholars from around the world. The library they dismissed as dusty old books had been featured in Architectural Digest, Literary Review, and UNESCO's quarterly publication on cultural preservation. Professional lighting highlighted the most significant pieces. Climate-controlled display cases showed rotating selections from the collection. Interactive digital catalogs allowed visitors to search the complete inventory. A state-of-the-art conservation lab occupied what had once been grandmother's sewing room. "This is incredible," Elena said, running her manicured fingers along a display case containing some of grandmother's less sensitive treasures. "Really incredible. But Maya, think bigger. This is just the prototype. We could franchise this concept, literary sanctuaries. We could have them in major cities across Europe. Think of the brand potential." She was already pacing, her marketing mind spinning up possibilities. Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Berlin, each one focused on different aspects of Central European literary history. We could develop educational programs, digital partnerships, maybe even streaming content. The cultural tourism market alone is worth billions. Father nodded enthusiastically, seeing dollar signs in every carefully preserved manuscript. "You've proven the concept works. Now you need business expertise to scale it properly. We could help you manage the expansion, bring in investors, take this global." "Or," Mother added, "you could relocate the entire operation to Prague. The city would love to have something like this. Much more accessible than this remote village. Better transportation, more hotel options for visitors. You'd reach 10 times as many people." I let them talk, their words washing over me like familiar music played in the wrong key. Elena sketched out marketing strategies. Father discussed licensing opportunities and revenue streams. Mother planned social events that would attract wealthy donors and cultural influencers. They talked for 20 minutes, maybe 30, building castles in the air from the foundation I'd laid. When they finally finished, breathless with excitement over the empire they'd imagined, I walked them to the garden where a bronze plaque gleamed in the afternoon sun. The Vaclava Novak Literary Sanctuary. Donated in perpetuity to the International Archive Preservation Foundation. Protected under Czech cultural heritage law and international treaty. Established 2024. "The books were never for sale," I said quietly, my voice carrying the same calm certainty grandmother had possessed when she spoke about things that mattered. "This isn't a business, it's a legacy, and you were never part of it." Elena's smile faltered for the first time since she'd arrived. "Maya, don't be ridiculous. We're family. Of course we want to help you succeed." "Are we?" I asked, meeting her gaze directly. "When did you last read a book that wasn't about marketing strategies or business optimization? When did either of you show interest in anything I cared about before it became internationally recognized and potentially profitable?" The silence stretched uncomfortably across the garden, where grandmother's roses bloomed in wild profusion. "When I graduated with my master's degree in library science, none of you came to the ceremony. When I got my first job at the university archive, Dad asked me when I was going to get a real career. When I tried to talk about manuscripts I was working on, you changed the subject to Elena's latest promotion or Mother's charity galas." Father cleared his throat with the authority of someone accustomed to controlling conversations. "Now see here, Maya, that's hardly fair. Grandmother saw what you couldn't," I interrupted, something I'd never done before in my life. "She knew I wasn't interested in profit or recognition. She knew I'd understand that some treasures aren't meant to be owned. They're meant to be protected." I gestured toward the house, where afternoon light was beginning to slant through the library windows. The sanctuary opens to its first cohort of resident scholars next month. Researchers from 12 countries have applied for fellowships. The collection will be studied, preserved, and shared with the world exactly as it was meant to be. Exactly as grandmother intended. But what about us? Elena asked, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. What about the family? Don't we deserve some benefit from all this? I looked at my family, really looked at them, and felt something like pity. They'd spent so long measuring worth in market value that they'd forgotten some things were priceless precisely because they couldn't be bought. You have your apartment in Prague, Elena. You have your successful career, and your important clients, and your social media following. You have everything you thought mattered. I turned to our parents. You have your comfortable retirement, your investment portfolios, your position in Prague society. You have the life you built by always choosing the profitable path over the meaningful one. And I have this, I continued, gesturing toward the house where centuries of voices waited to be heard. I have the responsibility grandmother trusted me with. I have work that matters more than money, recognition that comes from preserving rather than promoting, and the peace of knowing I'm exactly where I belong. I walked them to their car, polite but final. As they prepared to leave, Elena rolled down her window with the expression of someone making a last-ditch appeal. This won't last, Maya. You'll get bored playing scholar in the middle of nowhere. When you're ready to do something serious with your life, call me. I'll help you monetize this properly. I didn't bother to respond. Some conversations end themselves. As their car disappeared down the lane, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. For the first time in my adult life, I was completely free from their expectations, their judgment, their need to transform everything I touched into something they could understand and exploit. I was finally, completely myself. The dedication ceremony took place on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after grandmother's death. The village had never seen anything like it. International scholars, government officials, journalists from major newspapers and cultural magazines. The local inn was fully booked for the first time in decades. Mrs. Sieng, Chishkova's bakery ran out of pastries by noon. Dr. Svoboda gave the keynote address, speaking eloquently about the importance of preserving literary heritage and the courage required to protect unpopular truths during dark periods of history. The Czech Minister of Culture presented me with a medal for exceptional services to national heritage. A documentary crew from the BBC filmed everything for a program about lost archives and the unsung heroes who saved them. But the moment I treasured most came later, when the crowds had thinned and only a handful of the most dedicated scholars remained. Dr. Harper found me in the library, reading through one of grandmother's journals by the warm glow of the original brass reading lamps she'd used for 60 years. She would be proud, Dr. Harper said simply, settling into the chair where grandmother had spent countless evenings with her books. I looked around the room where I'd first learned to love literature, where I discovered that words could survive wars and governments and family disapproval. Moonlight streamed through stained glass windows I'd had professionally restored, casting colored shadows across shelves that now held treasures scholars would study for generations. The first fellowship recipients had already arrived. A young historian from Oxford studying wartime manuscript preservation, a Prague professor researching banned literature of the communist era, a documentary filmmaker from the Netherlands capturing oral histories of people who'd risked their lives to save books. She gave me dust and pages, I said, echoing thoughts I'd been carrying all year. But inside them were voices that had waited centuries to be heard. And now, they sing. The next morning brought new possibilities, as mornings always did in the sanctuary. I opened a fresh crate of donated manuscripts. A private collector in Vienna had decided to entrust his collection of Kafka correspondence to our care rather than sell it to the highest bidder. Sunlight poured through the restored windows, warming the room where my grandmother's voice still whispered from every carefully preserved page. Dr. Chen, our first resident conservator, was already at work in the laboratory, using techniques that would have seemed like magic to previous generations of book preservers. Through the window, I could see two graduate students discussing their research in the garden, surrounded by roses that bloomed more beautifully now that they were tended with love rather than mere duty. This was my inheritance, not just a house or a collection, but a purpose that connected me to centuries of people who'd understood that some things matter more than profit. I was part of a chain of guardians stretching back through time. Monks copying manuscripts in candlelit scriptoriums, librarians hiding books from burning mobs, professors smuggling forbidden texts across borders in the dead of night. And I was no longer invisible. The world had finally learned to listen to the voices I'd always been able to hear. In newspapers and academic journals, in documentary films and scholarly conferences, the story was being told of a grandmother who'd spent 60 years saving literary treasures, and a granddaughter who'd understood that the greatest inheritance isn't money, it's responsibility. I smiled softly as I began cataloging the new acquisitions, finally at peace with the understanding that I had found not just my purpose, but my home. In this house full of voices, surrounded by stories that refused to be silenced, I was exactly where I belonged. The voices sang, and the world was listening, and I was the one who'd learned to hear them first.